In the last talk, we talked about this huge problem of polio. And we were just beginning to get into these key players in solving that problem. And in looking at them, we want to be focusing on the way they use competition, the way they used extrapolation, and the way they use craft as a way of solving this problem. Those are 3 of our 10 new terms, and we'll be exploring them in this talk. So the key player we're looking at here is Jonas Salk, but we're also looking at these 2 other people around him. One is Tommy Francis, who, as I mentioned in the last talk, was this epidemiologist who had been working on flu vaccines and was a real expert in flu vaccines. He was a real mentor to Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk grew up in a pretty poor family, and he had gone to City College in New York, which was the poor boys' school. He was Jewish. He was discriminated against, couldn't go to any of the Tony Ivy League schools because they had quotas for Jewish guys. And he'd really been a little bit left behind. But Tommy Francis met him at Mount Sinai Hospital, which was a Jewish hospital. And he thought he was really sharp. So he kind of brought him into his research group and became a real mentor to him. And he then took him to University of Michigan when he took an academic appointment there. So Francis hired him in Michigan in 1942. Very shortly thereafter, he got drafted because it was the middle of World War II. And it was Tommy Francis who appealed to his draft board and said, no, look, this research on flu vaccine is more important than any yeoman job that Jonas Salk could be doing in the Army. I need him in my lab. And so he got him a deferment so that he worked in the lab instead of going off as a soldier in World War II. Tommy Francis taught him about vaccines and about vaccine research. And he also planted very firmly in his head this notion of a killed virus vaccine. So you kill the virus, you put it into the body, and there's enough of a resistance that it will give immunity, but only for a limited period of time, and then it has to be renewed, just like we get flu vaccines every year. By 1947, Salk had been so successful in Tommy Francis' lab, in some ways he kind of was taking over the place. He was writing a lot of the papers that came out of the lab. He was supervising the other people in the lab, but he was not getting a lot of credit for that. Tommy Francis was the famous guy, much a generation older, and he had the big reputation. So he was bringing in the grants, but they were really being executed significantly by Salk. And he didn't think that was totally fair, so he says that to Tommy Francis, and Tommy Francis, as his mentor, says, yeah, I get it, I understand. And he got him a little more pay, and he began to give him a little more credit, but that still wasn't quite enough for Jonas Salk. And finally, in 1947, he decided, I just need to get out from under the influence of my mentor. It's been great with him, but I need to make my own independent reputation. So he moves to University of Pittsburgh, which honestly was the sticks. It was nowhere. And it was going to be hard to make a reputation at a university that didn't have the kind of reputation University of Michigan did for doing first-class research. So from 1947 to 1954, he's working on polio vaccine. And the guy who's the top of the field in that area is Albert Sabin. And Sabin is much older and much more established. And he's a really arrogant kind of guy. In 1949, Sabin and Salk and Tommy Francis were actually working together on what was called a typing study for polio. How many types of polio are there out there? And we need to gather hundreds of thousands of samples from people who had polio, and we need to see what strains there are. If we're going to make a vaccine, we need to make sure it addresses all kinds of polio. So that was just kind of grunt work, but there was this committee set up to make that happen. At that point, they didn't know exactly who would do it. In the end, it ended up being Jonas Salk, who did the typing study, but it was supervised by this committee. And Sabin was rude to Salk from the very beginning. As Salk said, it was like being kicked in the teeth. I could feel the resistance, the hostility, and the disapproval. I never attended a single one of those meetings afterwards without the same feeling. From the very beginning, he got this hostility from Albert Sabin. Sabin didn't think much of Salk. He thought he was just an errand boy for the National Foundation. And as I mentioned in the last talk, it was the foundation that was funding these studies. So he thought, this kid is just a kiss-up, trying to get more funding from the foundation than I get. And he felt very competitive toward him. And he just thought, there's no substance, it's all hype. So he was very critical of Salk. Sabin even began to dispute the findings that Salk was getting in this typing study. So he's doing all this grunt work. He's established a big group of people there at University of Pittsburgh, which was good. It enabled him to really build up an established research center at University of Pittsburgh. But they were doing very yeoman work, taking all these samples and analyzing them and doing the typing study. So in the process of doing that, Salk got to know this virus better than anyone in the world. He'd seen more variations of it, and he'd really studied it. But Sabin was disputing everything he did in this typing study, even though in this particular case, although Salk was younger, he was the expert. He knew the typing study better than Sabin did. But Sabin was in the old boys club. Salk was just an underdog. Salk had not worked for the prestigious institutes like the Rockefeller Institute. He didn't have a degree from Harvard or Yale or Johns Hopkins. He was just a kind of public school guy. And he was marooned in Pittsburgh. He wasn't at one of the great universities known for their research. Sabin also disagreed that the killed virus vaccine was the way to go. He believed you need to do a live virus vaccine. So you would attenuate the virus, sort of damp it down enough so that you could inject it in the body without somebody getting polio, but then it would last. It would stay there. You wouldn't have to have a booster or renewal every year. The other thing he totally disagreed with Salk on was Sabin thought it was undignified to get any publicity. You're a scientist. You should be just talking to other scientists. And being out there in this whole public relations thing that the National Institute and Basil O'Connor were doing, this got your hands dirty. This was messy. This is not what a real scientist does. And so he refused to take part in any of that. Sabin ridiculed Salk for participating in the world outside of science and outside of, he thought you do the research, you write a paper, you get it published in a journal, you get it peer reviewed, and you get feedback on it, and then you take the next step. But you don't talk to the larger world about science. Now, let's focus for a minute on these issues that I said we were going to talk about, like craft and like extrapolation. So Salk is sitting there doing the grunt work. He's really doing the craft. He did these typing studies. He got a big grant to do it, but it was really grunt work, and he was just hiring yeoman people at University of Pittsburgh to do that. It was mind-numbingly repetitious, hundreds of thousands of individual entries that had to go through a procedure, and it took a large staff to do that. So he was willing to do that grunt work, to really do the craft, to get to know this virus in a way nobody else did. And he could see these yeoman tasks that would give him incredible knowledge about the virus and about how to get to a vaccine. He was paying his dues, and he was happy to learn his craft that way. The other thing that Salk was interested in was extrapolation, another of our 10 new terms. He was more open-minded and more freewheeling than most scientists at his time. He was willing to make a leap. He was willing to predict, to take the findings he had and extrapolate them to the next step. He said, I engaged in extrapolation because I had always felt that it was a legitimate means of provoking scientific thought and discussion. I engaged in prediction because I felt that it was the essence of scientific thought. The fact that neither extrapolation or prediction was popular in viricological circles seemed to me to be a shame. And it was exactly Sabin who was the one saying, no, you don't do extrapolation, you don't do prediction. And Salk disagreed with him on that account. Salk was an outsider, he was a risk taker, he was a very rebellious guy. He didn't always do it the way everybody else had done it. And he had enough confidence in his science and in his ability to strike out. And even though he was the young guy, he was the outsider, he was willing to do it his way and proceed. So Salk moves from this typing study to then developing the vaccine. And the problem of growing the poliovirus was solved by other people. They grew it in the brains of monkeys at the beginning, but then they found out that that created some contamination and ended up growing it successfully in the kidneys of monkeys. So they would grow this poliovirus. Then they tested it to see exactly what strain would be powerful enough to create immunity, but docile enough to do no harm. So he's killing the virus with formaldehyde, but he has to have just the right ratio to do that. He's testing that through. In December of 1951, he makes his first presentation on the killed virus vaccine and the results of the trials in monkeys. And he felt like it was successful enough to experiment on humans at that point. And this became very controversial much later, but the first people they tested it on were in a crippled children's hospital. Basically, it was kids who'd already had polio. And they could learn some things from that. But they needed some kids who didn't have any immunity to the virus. And very controversially, they went to a mental health hospital for children, and they tested the vaccine on them. If it had been a failure, that would have been terrible because those kids would have gotten polio. But in fact, it turned out to be a successful test. So then in February of 1953, there is a big article in Time magazine, most popular journal of the time, and it has Jonas Salk on the cover. And this just sends Sabin into fits of rage. What are you, he hadn't even developed the vaccine. It had not been approved. He's just talking about, I think there's a good chance we can do this. The limited testing we've done has been great. But Sabin was just apoplectic about it. Now, the National Foundation understood why you have to have that kind of publicity. Basil O'Connor presented Salk at a big conference in the Waldorf Astoria in New York. And he arranged for Salk to go on national TV in 1953 to do this 15-minute talk about the progress that was being made toward a vaccine. And they absolutely had to get that kind of publicity because in order to do a trial, they had to have 1.2 million children participate. The incidence of polio was only 50 in 100,000 people. So in order to really get a good sample here, they thought they needed 600,000 people who would get the inoculation. And then because they were going to give a placebo to half the people, They needed 2 times 600,000, so they needed 1,200,000 children to participate in this. This is parents saying, I'm going to let my freaking child be a guinea pig in this research for a vaccine. So they needed the kind of positive publicity that Salk was getting in order to get the word out there and to recruit enough people to participate in a real scientific trial. By 1954, 2/3 of the people in the United States had donated money to the March of Dimes. 7 million people had volunteered their time for the organization. This was a Herculean public effort, and it was important to include those people in the science, and Salk understood that. So he tested it on those 1.2 million children, half of whom got a placebo. They got the results. They sent them to Tommy Francis' lab. He was the one who was meant to verify all of this. It took a year for the verification. In the end, in March 1955, they announced that the vaccine was successful, and they rolled it out really quickly. They just inoculated kids in public schools. And I remember getting the vaccine myself when I was a little kid. And it was safe, and it was effective, and it was potent, and basically it solved the problem of polio. And Salk became a hero. He's again on the cover of Time magazine. The very most popular interview show at the Times, the sort of Oprah of that day, was the Edward R. Murrow Show. There's a huge 1-hour segment on the Edward R. Murrow Show with an interview with Jonas Salk. Sabin continues his work in the meantime. He had begun it long ago, given the fact that he couldn't test it in America because basically they already had the vaccine in America. He went to Russia and he tested his vaccine in Russia. It was a live virus vaccine, so you didn't have to have a booster every year as you did with the Salk vaccine. That was all completed in 1959. And so in 1959 in the US, we began to use the Sabin vaccine. It was a little drop they put on a sugar cube. And again, everyone was vaccinated with the Sabin vaccine, and that meant you didn't have to have a renewal every year like you did for the Salk vaccine. And so for years, we used the Sabin vaccine. Then finally, a decade or so ago, we went back to using the Salk vaccine because we're very close to eliminating polio completely in the entire world. But as long as you're giving a live virus vaccine, you're keeping the polio vaccine out there. But if you use a killed virus vaccine, you could potentially completely eliminate the virus in the world. And we're getting pretty close to doing. Now, it's very interesting that Jonas Salk died not too different time than Albert Sabin. When Jonas Salk died, there was this huge outpouring of appreciation for the contribution he'd made. Poor Albert Sabin was a relatively unknown character, kind of a footnote in scientific history. Now, the big takeaway on this is look how Salk used craft and extrapolation to kick the ass of his competitor, Albert Sabin. The competition was good for both of those people. They stepped up their game big time because of that competition. But in the end, it was because Salk did the craft, the grunt work of that typing study, and because he had this idea about extrapolation, that you could advance an ideal and you could take the risk with it, that Sabin was actually not very comfortable with. So again, in the check-in, we'll be discussing a bit of this notion of how that craft idea is kind of left brain activity. That extrapolation idea is kind of right brain activity. How it was the combination of left brain linear problem solving in terms of the typing study and right brain extrapolation and projection that really helped Salk to solve this problem in an incredibly creative way. Okay, see you later.